that I was only going to give you a short time. I did warn you that I was only going to give you a short time, but you keep eating. Anybody who does public speaking knows how to talk over the sound of plates being distributed and glasses tinkling and all those sorts of things. So please continue enjoying your lunch. But as I said earlier, we've got a packed program, so we want to make sure we've got plenty of time and are not rushed. Again, my name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 35-year-old free market, limited government, individual liberty policy organization based right here in Dallas, Texas, and founded in 1987 by one of our special guests today, former Congressman Dick Armey, who's at the table here. So we're delighted. We're delighted to be reunited with our founder, at least for lunch today. I mentioned earlier that I'm having a wave of sort of good old days syndrome and nostalgia. Many of us in this room are old enough to remember when Congress actually worked, when appropriations bills actually got passed, when regular order was followed, when people ran for Congress because they wanted to do the serious job of legislating. Those were good days. It was that kind of legislating. And Phil Gramm, by the way, wrote an op-ed about this in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year. It was that kind of hard work, legislating, making difficult choices and compromising that got the Reagan budget through, that cut taxes, that put us on a multi-decade growth path, that defeated the Soviet Union. That's serious legislating. That's problem-solving legislating where people work across the aisle, they negotiate, they compromise, and they find ways to get things done. I think you will all probably agree with me that that is no longer the way Congress behaves in this age. In this age, people run for Congress to build their brand. They have no intention of legislating. They have no intention of doing the hard work. They run to build their brand and raise their profile and get more followers on Instagram and get more headshots on cable TV so that they can do something with it when they're done. They don't serve Congress, they use Congress. They don't serve the public, they use the public. And it's a dismal time. And so that's part of why I'm having this wave of good old days syndrome. I can faintly hear the echo in the air of a better time when instead of both fighters retreating to their corners, they came out and engaged with each other and legislated. And so I'm so pleased today. We're going to be focusing on this exciting new book by Senator Phil Gramm and the important data that it contains. But I'm also so pleased today that we're able to share with you legislators from the good old days when Congress functioned and when things got done. And I want to recognize those who are here with us. Of course, our special guest, Senator Phil Gramm. In just a moment, Jeb Henserling will be doing a formal introduction to Phil Gramm. So Jeb Henserling is here. As I said, IPI's founder, former chairman of the House of Representatives, former majority leader, Congressman Dick Armey. Longtime Irving Republican member of Congress, Kenny Marchant, is somewhere. Where's Kenny? Over here, I'm sorry. Kenny's over here. And longtime, roughly Fort Worth, Arlington member of Congress, Joe Barton is here. Joe, thank you for being with us here. So thank you for coming and sharing this with us today. If you want to know more about the Institute for Policy Innovation, and I hope you do, you can go to our website. It's ipi.org. It's very simple. Or you can speak to any of the IPI folks that are here in the room today, especially Addie Crimmins at the back room there. Addie is our Director of Events and Development. Addie did most of the work related to this luncheon today, so we thank you, Addie. Addie would be thrilled to tell you more about IPI and how you could get more involved. I also want to recognize our former board chair, Marv Bramlett, who is here. Marv, glad to have you here. And current board members, current board chair, Wayne Stoltenberg, is here. And board member Landy Alvarez is here. So thank you so much for joining us. And that's enough from me. Now I want to introduce Jeb Henserling. Jeb Henserling was the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and also chair of the House Republican Conference for a while, I think, which is the role that Dick Armey held before he became Majority Leader, chairman of the House Republican Congress. So we are so thrilled to have you folks with us today. Please give a warm welcome for Congressman Jeb Henserling.
Well, thank you very much. Please, I see a number of you are still eating. Please continue to enjoy your meal. Phil, Dick, my former colleagues, as former members of Congress, we've had lots of practice in speaking and having no one pay attention to anything we have to say. So please feel free to enjoy your meal. I am so excited about this program. I don't know how many of you have read Senator Gramm's new book. If you haven't, speaking more for myself, it is the single most important book I have ever read that averages 52 statistics per page. Anyway, as my colleagues know, and it's so great to be with so many of my former colleagues, when you leave Congress, it is indeed your colleagues that you miss. And not unlike my colleagues, you're given a lot of honors when you speak at various events, and so we all have an incredible collection of ball caps and T-shirts and plaques. My wife's least favorite was coffee cups. She once told me if I brought home another coffee cup, she was going to divorce me, so that did it with the coffee cups. But one of the greatest honors I ever had as a member of Congress was to be able to introduce my former professor of money and banking at Texas A&M University. Go ahead. My former boss, a man who probably about everything good that happened to me in my adult life I can trace back to Phil Gramm. So indeed, thank you, IPI, for this wonderful honor. I want to be brief for two reasons. Number one, I come from the House, not the Senate. We don't filibuster, we don't bloviate for 2 hours. As Leader Armey knows, we get down to business. So I think that's the last of the humor that I have. A couple of the senator's accomplishments have already been brought up. If you are a student of history of the Republican and the conservative movement in the late 20th century, you know it was the Gramm-Lott budget that helped rebuild national defense, ultimately tore down the Berlin Wall. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, the most modern pro-growth banking bill ever since the Depression. The end of Hillary Care. Gramm-Rudman, really the last legislation that made any dent in the federal deficit that was measurable. Now, these would be all great accomplishments of one Congress, but in some respects, they are the accomplishments of one member of Congress, and we will hear from him soon. Now, I don't mean that literally, but I want to end on this note. Of all the time I have been in public office, and in all the time I have paid attention to politics, I never knew a leader of the conservative movement who showed greater tenacity, greater intellect, greater communication skills, greater patriotism, and I never, ever saw Phil Gramm lose a debate, and I saw him rally others with his courage. And that is the true test of the man. So I made light of it when I said earlier that we speak, nobody pays attention to what we say. My colleagues know, the leader knows this. There are a handful of members in the House, and there were a handful of members in the Senate, that when they were recognized, people listened. And in the United States Senate, when you heard the words, "The gentleman from Texas, Senator Gramm, is recognized," a hush came over the gallery, and senators listened because they knew a man of consequence was about to speak important truths. Ladies and gentlemen, the gentleman from Texas, Senator Phil Gramm.
I wish my mama could have heard that. Well, you have to take into account that Jeb Henseling and I love each other in listening to those comments. I remember Jeb was a student of mine at Texas A&M. He was in my money and banking class. And little did I know that two future chairmen of the banking committee were in the same class. It probably never happened in any other classroom in America. And then Jeb came to work for me as an intern, and then he came back to work. He became a lawyer, and he was working for a big law firm, and he called me up one afternoon and was telling me that he was writing a will and he was having trouble staying awake, and did I have a job? And so he came to work for me. And when he ran for Congress, I had a rule that I didn't endorse people in the primary. I thought it was important for people to make their own choice. And then I started thinking, you know, this is probably as close as I will ever come in my life to having a son run for Congress. So I did endorse Jeb Henseling, and I simply said I would trust Jeb Henseling with my life, and what's more important, I would trust him with the life of the nation. And the nation was in good hands when he was there. I'm so happy to be here. I guess, first of all, I should say to everybody here, thank you for letting me represent the greatest state in the greatest country in the history of the world. And I can't not mention my colleagues that are here. Dick Armey. I used to love seeing Dick. We met once a week. And Dick sort of thought of himself as this spy who had gone to the Soviet Union and joined the Communist Party and become one of the leaders of the Soviet Union. And so the sort of perspective of his comments each week was, this is what I discovered about the American government this week. He was running the American government. And I would say about my dear friend and successor in Congress, Joe Barton, I resigned from Congress and ran again as a Republican. Most of y'all probably don't remember that. But it was a very unusual circumstance, and it was a simple campaign. I had to choose between y'all and Tip O'Neill. I chose y'all. That's the only thing I ever said in the whole campaign. But what made our district Republican was Joe Barton won it. Now, today I want to talk about a book that I've written. And it is about an important issue. You know, we don't think of statistics as being very important, but in the world we live in, we have the ability to understand, are we happy or not? Generally, depending on whether we want to be happy. we have a ability to sort of judge our own individual situation, but almost everything else we judge on the basis of statistics. What's GDP? What's the poverty rate? What's the average wage? What do other people make? Those are all important statistics in determining our opinion of the world we live in. And our perception of the present has a profound impact on the future. Now, in the late 1980s, for a fairly short period of time, I was chairman of Commerce State Justice Appropriations. And I was working on the budget, and I had written Gramm-Rudman, and we were trying to enforce it. And I oversaw the Census Bureau on my little subcommittee. And so I started looking at census data on poverty, on income distribution. At the same time, I was looking at the American budget. And it struck me then, for the first time, that something is wrong here. The money I see us spending in the budget doesn't seem to be showing up in the income figures of the country. And then a seat opened on finance. I left appropriations, a committee I hated because I didn't like spending money. And I forgot about it until 2017. And in 2017, I started thinking about this problem again. And there were two things in the statistics of that year that really drove home the point that I had been right long ago. The Census Bureau every year comes out with a figure on household income. It's the building block of all the statistics in the country on income, poverty, income distribution. And it's broken out into 5 different categories, quintiles, the bottom 20% up to the top 20%. And at roughly the same time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out with the same data, but on what people spend, on what they consume. And in 2017, the bottom 20% of American earners spent twice as much as they earned. The second 20% spent 10% more than it earned, and the top 20% spent 40% less than it earned, even though there was no evidence that anybody was saving 40% of their income, at least not 20% of the population of the country. And so then I looked at the poverty figure, and from the end of the Second World War until 1965, the poverty rate plummeted in the country by almost 50%. And then we started the War on Poverty, and in the first year of the funding of that program, the average household in the bottom 20% of income earners got $9,700 worth of benefits from the government. By 2017, that number was $45,400. And you know what happened to the poverty rate between 1967 and 2017, 50 years later? Nothing. Now, you ask yourself, how is it we can give people, on average, a household, $45,400, and we don't change the number of people who are poor? And so that's what started this project. And the answer is, you don't count what you give them and they stay poor. What we found in this, that's in this book, and I hope, I've given the royalties of this book away, so I just want you to read it because it's full of powerful information to defend our system and the things we believe in. Now, what we found is the Census Bureau, in calculating household income, does not count 2/3 of all federal, state, and local transfer payments as income to the people that receive the payments. It doesn't count refundable tax credits where you get a check from the Treasury. You remember, some of you may have seen the article. The president said if we double the child tax credit, we'll cut child poverty in half. So I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal and said, you won't. And sure enough, when the poverty figure came out the next year, it was unchanged. Why? Because refundable tax credits are not counted by the Census Bureau as income to people that got the check. The Census Bureau doesn't count any payment that is made in kind, like you get a debit card for food stamps, and you take the debit card to the grocery store, you buy food, and the government pays the debit card. Rent subsidies, the government pays the rent. Medicaid, government pays the health care bill. The Census Bureau does not count over 100 federal programs and dozens of state programs that provide benefits to people, most of whom are fairly low-income people. For the bottom 20% of income earners, the government does not count 88% of their income. Now, the government also does not take into account taxes. So when it's saying that we're finding that people are spending only 60% of their income, what is happening to the other 40%? Well, for the people in the top 20% of income earners, 35% of it is going to the federal, state, and local government in taxes. So here is what all this means. Today, the Census Bureau says that the top 20% of income earners in America have 16.7 times as much income as the bottom 20%. But if you count all transfer payments as income to people who got the payment, and you count all taxes paid as income lost by people who paid the taxes, the ratio is not 16.7 to 1, but 4 to 1. Now, you can argue 4 to 1 is too much, but it's a very different debate than 16.7 to 1. The poverty rate has oscillated between 11% and 16% for over 50 years. But if you count all transfer payments as income and all taxes as income lost, the poverty rate is not 12.4%, but it's 2.5%. Now, you've all heard the thing that it is to quote The Economist magazine, it is universally recognized that income in the West, that income inequality in the West is high and rising. You've heard Bernie Sanders say that income inequality in America is obscene. It's un-American. It's unsustainable. Well, listen to this. If you count all transfer payments as income and you count all taxes as income lost, income inequality today is 3% lower than it was in 1947. Now, we're having a big debate in America about the crisis of income inequality when income inequality has actually fallen over the last 70 years. And this data is calculated using IRS data, where you go to prison if you don't declare the income, or at least most people do. And so none of the stuff you're hearing about inequality and about poverty has much relationship to the facts. So when you have a question, should you believe your own eyes or believe your government? Believe your own eyes. And it's interesting because while the Wall Street Journal rated the book as one of the 5 most important books of the year, the New York Times has basically refused to comment on it because there's no response to it. Now, we have had various efforts by people on the left in debates or in things they've written to respond by simply saying things like, well, you can't eat Medicaid. But actually, the government's cost in providing Medicaid, since they pay 50% less than private purchasers, middle-income Americans spend more for health insurance than the government does for Medicaid, and they can't eat health insurance either. An interesting statistic we find, which I think explains a lot of the rise of modern populism, is that the bottom 60% of income earners have basically the same income. So if you want to understand resentment in America, you're talking about an income, an area where you've got husband and wife both working, they're hardly making ends meet, and right down the street is somebody who's not breaking a sweat, and yet they are basically living the same standard of living that the couple with 2 people working are enjoying. In fact, if you adjust for the number of people living in the household, a per capita number, which can be a little misleading when you're talking about families, but nevertheless, when you adjust for the number of people living in the household, the incomes are virtually identical for the bottom 60% of income earners in America. Now, we do a lot of other things in the book. We look at who are the super rich. Do they pay their fair share of taxes? And using IRS data, the tax system is increasingly progressive up to roughly $20 million a year. Above that income level, because people are earning more and more from capital gains, and because at these very high income levels, there are 130,000 households that are giving vast amounts of money away, the average tax rate dips down to just a little under 30%. But are rich people paying their fair share, whatever that is? In terms of progressive taxes, we have the most progressive tax system in the world. No other developed country has high-income people pay a larger share of the income tax burden, including income-based taxes like Social Security and Medicare. No other country on earth has taxes as progressive as we have. Now, you've all heard this stuff about you've got a guy named Saves, and you got a guy, what's the guy from the French economist? Yeah, I still can't hear it, but I'm old and deaf. And anyway, you've heard their argument that the tax system is not progressive. We took their numbers apart and found basically their numbers are based on 2 very important assumptions. One, they don't count any transfer payments. So that means that the bottom 20%, they're not counting 88% of their income. And for upper income people, they don't use income as we measure it, but their measure of income is what would your income be if you sold every asset you owned every year and paid capital gains taxes on it? Well, needless to say, if you do it that way, you get their result. You probably heard about the ProPublica article where they stole the tax returns of people like Warren Buffett. But again, there's a bait and switch here. They apparently have how much Buffett paid in taxes, more than you did, more than I did. But they don't have Buffett's declared taxable income. They don't show that. They show you if Buffett sold every asset he owned, what his income would be, and therefore what his percentage of real taxes, as they call it, he's paying. Well, my God, if we sold our house every year, cashed out of our retirement every year, we would all have a nice year of income, and so would the government. But you can only do it once. That's, again, part of their trick. Now, another thing you need to understand is, and I'm getting ready to quit. You've all heard that we've had taxes with as high a rate as 90%. When John Kennedy was president, he cut taxes from 90 to 70%. But do you know how many filers paid the top rate in the Depression? 3. 3 filers paid the top rate in the Depression, and 17 paid the top rate in World War II. Those headline rates were there, and they probably affected some people's behavior, but nobody paid them. The taxes collected as a percentage of income today are about as high as they've ever been in American history. Now, final point. How much mobility is there? What are your chances if you're born and grow up in the bottom 20% of income earners of doing better than your parents? 93% based on the experience since 1980. And what are your chances of actually moving up into a higher income bracket? Well, we looked at the studies that have been done of what happens to people who are born and grow up in the various quintiles of income, and over 63% of the people who were born and grew up in the bottom quintile in the 1980s had risen to a higher quintile as adults than their parents, and 6.3% had gone all the way to the top quintile. Of the people born in the top quintile, over 9% as adults fell into the bottom quintile. But there's a little trick there that I didn't understand when we wrote the book, but I understand now. You're comparing the children that were born in 1980 in the various quintiles to the adults that were born in the 1980s and the quintiles then, but people earn almost twice as much as they did then. So when you compare people to their parents, the escape rate was almost 80% among low-income Americans. And remember, another thing the book shows, when we started this welfare buildup, 68% of able-bodied people of prime work age, that is, they weren't in school, they weren't retired, they weren't disabled, 68% worked. Today, that number is 36%. 36% of the bottom 20% of income earners in America work. That is the main reason that those who don't move up don't move up. So the conclusion of the book, opportunity is alive and well in America. We also look at the causes of earned income inequality. Why do some people make a lot of money and some people don't? There are a lot of reasons, but there are two big ones. One, do you work? Okay? If you work, the economy is like an escalator. It's important to understand this. America is still making tremendous progress. So if you work, you get on that elevator, just by standing still, you make progress. And if you walk up the elevator, you make even more progress. The second thing is what my mother would call, how sharp are your tools? How much education do you have in both quantity and quality? If you could change anything about America, if I could change anything about America, it would be I would have a mandatory work requirement for able-bodied people drawing public assistance for their own good. And two, I would do something about the quality of public education. And I'm not saying school choice is a be-all and end-all or it solves every problem in the world, but it is the only thing where there's proven data that demonstrates that school choice works. And the amazing thing is, it works in the inner city, which says to me, final point, there is extraordinary ability in ordinary people that we are not discovering. There are people in the schools in South Oak Cliff who've got ability that is not being realized, and the country's not benefiting from it, and they're not benefiting from it. So anyway, that's what the book is about. Please read it. It's not long, it's not hard. Don't be put off by the statistics. When you're telling people everything they know is wrong, you got to provide some data. But if you read the words, it explains it. Thank you very much.